Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. My topic for tonight is campus protests and fascism. And I see a few of you are here, but I don't know who. So perhaps you will announce yourselves as we go forward. Right now, I'm going to start us off by sharing I'm going to share a piece from Common Dreams. Don't think I shared it yet, though. See the policeman, California Highway Patrol officer, very militarized, detaining a protester while clearing a pro-Palestinian encampment after dispersal orders were given at the University of California, Los Angeles. The headline is, "Courageous Students Disrupt America's Culture of Death and War." Leaders of the most powerful American institutions want to continue as usual, as if official participation in genocide, no particular cause for alarm. Those protesting on campuses nationwide have shown us how repugnant and unacceptable that position is. The author of this piece is Norman Solomon, who used to be one of the surrogates for Bernie Sanders in 2020. And he originally published this at Tom Dispatch on May 10th, 2024. So Norm says, persisting in his support for an unpopular war, the Democrat in the White House has helped spark a rebellion close to home. Young people least inclined to deference, most inclined to moral outrage, are leading public opposition to the ongoing slaughter in Gaza. The campus upheaval is a clash between accepting and resisting, while elites insist on doing maintenance work for the war machine. I wrote the above words recently, but I could have written very similar ones in the spring of 1968. In fact, I did. Joe Biden hasn't sent U.S. troops to kill in Gaza, as President Lyndon Johnson did in Vietnam, but the current president has done all he can to provide massive quantities of weapons and ammunition to Israel. Literally making the carnage in Gaza possible. Familiar saying, quote, the more things change, the more they stay the same, unquote, is both false and true. During the last several decades, the consolidation of corporate power and the rise of digital tech have brought about huge changes in politics and communications. Yet humans are still humans, and certain crucial dynamics remain. Militarism demands conformity and sometimes fails to get it. When Columbia University and many other colleges erupted in anti-war protests during the 1960s, the moral awakening was a human connection with people suffering horrifically in Vietnam. During recent weeks, the same has been true in Gaza. Both eras saw crackdowns by college administrators and the police, as well as much negativity toward protesters in the mainstream media, all reflecting key biases in this country's power structure. Quote, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic, unquote. Martin Luther King said in 1967, and quote again, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love, unquote. Disrupting a culture of death this spring as students have risked arrest and jeopardized their college careers under banners like, quote, ceasefire now, unquote, quote, free Palestine, and, quote, divest from Israel, unquote. They've rejected some key unwritten rules of a death culture, from Congress to the White House, war, and the military-industrial complex that goes with it, is crucial for the political business model. Meanwhile, college trustees and alumni mega donors often have investment ties to Wall Street and Silicon Valley, where war is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Along the way, weapons sales to Israel and many other countries bring in gigantic profits. The new campus uprisings are a shock to the war system. Managers of that system, constantly oiling its machinery, have no column for moral revulsion on their balance sheets. And the refusal of appreciable numbers of students to go along to get along doesn't compute. For the economic and political establishment, it's a control issue, potentially writ large, as the killing, maiming, devastation, and increasing starvation in Gaza have continued month after month. The U.S. role has become incomprehensible, without at least attributing to the president and the vast majority of congressional representatives a level of immorality that had previously seemed unimaginable to most college students. Hi, honey. Like many others in the United States, protesting students are now struggling with the realization that the people in control of the executive and legislative branches are directly supporting mass murder and genocide. In late April, when overwhelming bipartisan votes in Congress approved and President Biden eagerly signed a bill sending $17 billion in military aid to Israel, the only way to dismiss the utter depravity of those atop the government was to not really look, or to remain in the thrall of a dominant death culture. During his final years in office, with the Vietnam War going full tilt, President Lyndon Johnson was treated with a chant, quote, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, unquote. Such a chant could be directed at President Biden now. The number of Palestinian children killed so far by the U.S. armed Israeli military is estimated to be almost 15,000. Not counting the unknown number still buried in the rubble of Gaza. Probably another 4,000 there. No wonder high-ranking Biden administration officials now risk being loudly denounced whenever they speak in venues open to the public. Further, mirroring the Vietnam War era in another way, members of Congress continue to rubber stamp huge amounts of funding for mass killing. On April 20th, Only 17% of House Democrats and only 9% of House Republicans voted against the new military aid package for Israel. Higher learning is supposed to connect the theoretical with the actual, striving to understand our world as it truly is. However, a death culture promoting college tranquility, as well as mass murder in Gaza, thrives on disconnects. All the platitudes and pretenses of academia can divert attention from where U.S. weapons actually go and what they do. Sadly, precepts readily cited as vital ideals prove all too easy to kick to the curb, lest they squeeze big toes uncomfortably. So when students take the humanities seriously enough to set up a protest encampment on campus, and then billionaire donors demand that a college president put a stop to such disruption, a police raid is likely to follow. A world of doublethink and tone deafness. George Orwell's explanation of doublethink, quote unquote, in his famed novel 1984, which I first read when I was in seventh grade. How old was I then? 12 years old, I'd say. So that was 73 years ago. Is a good fit when it comes to the purported logic of so many commentators deploring the student protesters as they demand an end to complicity in the slaughter still underway in Gaza. Quote, to know and not to know. To be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies. To hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory, and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, said Orwell. Laying claim to morality, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, has, for instance, been busy firing media salvos at the student protesters. That organization's CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, is on record flatly declaring that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No matter how many Jews declare themselves to be, quote, anti-Zionist, unquote. 4 months ago, ADL issued a report categorizing pro-Palestinian rallies with, quote, anti-Zionist chants and slogans as anti-Semitic events. In April, ADL used the, quote, anti-Semitic, unquote, label to condemn protests by students at Columbia, and elsewhere. A long time ago, I used to respect the ADL, but they have lost my respect. I now think they're a lobby group just like any other. Quote, we have a major generational problem, unquote. Greenblatt warned in a leaked ADL strategy phone call last November. I'm not sure it's so generational, because a lot of my generation are sick at what's going on in Gaza. He added, quote, the issue in the United States' support for Israel is not left and right, it is young and old. We really have a TikTok problem, a Gen Z problem. The real game is the next generation, unquote. Along with thinly veiled condescension towards students, a frequent approach is to treat the mass killing of Palestinians as of minimal importance. And so, when New York Times columnist Ross Batuhat wrote in late April about students protesting in Columbia, he merely described the Israeli government's actions as, quote, failings, unquote. Perhaps if a government was bombing and killing Dutat's loved ones, he would have used a different word. A similar mentality, as I well remember, infused media coverage of the Vietnam War. For mainline news outlets, what was happening to Vietnamese people ranked far below so many other concerns, often to the point of invisibility, as media accounts gradually began bemoaning the, quote, quagmire, unquote, of that war. The focus was on how the U.S. government's leadership had gotten itself so stuck. Acknowledging that the American war effort amounted to a massive crime against humanity was rare. Then as now, the moral bankruptcies of the political and media establishments fueled each other. As a barometer of the prevailing political climate among elites, the editorial stances of daily newspapers indicate priorities in times of war. In early 1968, the Boston Globe conducted a survey of 39 major U.S. newspapers and found that not a single one had editorialized in favor of the American withdrawal from Vietnam. By then, tens of millions of Americans were in favor of such a pullout. This spring, when the New York Times editorial board finally called for making U.S. arms shipments to Israel conditional, 6 months after the carnage began in Gaza, the editorial was tepid and displayed a deep ethnocentric bias. It declared that, quote, the Hamas attack of October 7th was an atrocity, unquote. But no word coming anywhere near, quote, atrocity, unquote, was applied to the Israeli attacks occurring ever since. The Times editorial lamented that, quote, Mr. Netanyahu and the hardliners in his government, unquote, had broken a, quote, bond of trust, unquote, between the United States and Israel. Adding, sorry, I inadvertently scrolled down. Between the United States and Israel, adding that the Israeli Prime Minister, quote, has been deaf to repeated demands from Mr. Biden and his national security team to do more to protect civilians in Gaza from being harmed by American armaments, unquote. The Times editorial board was remarkably prone to understatement, as if someone overseeing the mass killing of civilians every day for 6 months was merely not doing enough, quote, to protect civilians, unquote. Learning by doing. The thousands of student protesters encountering the edicts of college administrations and the violence of the police have gotten a real education in the true priorities of American power structures. Of course, the authorities on and off campus have wanted to return to the usual peaceful campus atmosphere. As military strategist Karl von Clausewitz long ago commented with irony, quote, a conqueror is always a lover of peace, unquote. Supporters of Israel are fed up with campus protests. The Washington Post recently featured an essay by Paul Berman that deplored what has become of his alma mater, Columbia. After a brief mention of Israel's killing of Gaza civilians and the imposition of famine, Berman declared that, quote, ultimately the central issue in the war is Hamas and its goal, the eradication of the Israeli state, unquote. The central issue, Consider it a way of saying that while unfortunate, the ongoing slaughter of tens of thousands of children and other Palestinian civilians doesn't matter nearly as much as the fear that nuclear-armed Israel, with one of the most powerful air forces in the world, is in danger of, quote, eradication, unquote. Pieces similar to Dowtats and Berman's have proliferated in the media, but they don't come to grips with what Senator Bernie Sanders recently made clear in a public message to the Israeli Prime Minister. Quote, Mr. Netanyahu, anti-Semitism is a vile and disgusting form of bigotry that has done unspeakable harm to millions. Do not insult the intelligence of the American people by attempting to distract us from the immoral and illegal war policies of your extremist and racist government, unquote. College protesters have shown they will not be distracted. They continue to insist, not flawlessly, but wonderfully, that all people's lives matter. For decades, and since October, in a particularly deadly fashion, the U.S.-Israel alliance has proceeded to treat Palestinian lives as expendable. And that is exactly what the protests are opposing. Of course, protests can flicker and die out. Hundreds of U.S. campuses shut down in the spring of 1970, and protests against the Vietnam War and the American invasion of Cambodia, only to become largely quiescent by the fall term. But for countless individuals, the sparks lit a fire for social justice that would never be quenched. One of them, Michael Albert, a co-founder of the groundbreaking Z magazine, has continued with activist work since the mid-1960s. Quote, a lot of people are comparing now to 1968, quote, he wrote in April. Quote, that year was tumultuous. We were inspired, we were hot, but here comes this year and it is moving faster, no less. That year, the left that I and so many others lived and breathed was mighty. We were courageous, but we also had too little understanding of how to win. Don't emulate us, transcend us, unquote. He then added, the emerging mass uprisings must persist and diversify and broaden and focus and reach. And hey, on your campuses again, do better than us. Fight to divest, but also fight to structurally change them so their decision makers, which should be you, never again invest in genocide, war, and indeed suppression and oppression of any kind. Tomorrow is the first day of a long, long, potentially incredibly liberating future. But one day is but one day. Persist, unquote. Persistence will be truly essential. The gears of pro-Israel forces are fully meshed with the U.S. war machinery. The movement to stop Israel's murderous oppression of Palestinians is up against the entire military-industrial congressional complex, I must add. It's the military-industrial congressional media complex, often spoken of by Ray McGovern as the Mickey Mat. The United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, and most of them are allies, while maintaining 750 military bases overseas, vastly more than all of its official adversaries put together. The U.S. continues to lead the nuclear arms race towards oblivion. I don't know about that. Seems to me the Russians have more warheads than we have, and at this point are probably manufacturing more. The U.S. continues to, And the economic cost is stunning. The Institute for Policy Studies reported last year that 62% of the federal discretionary budget went to, quote, to militarize programs, unquote, of one sort or another. 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. described his country's spending for war as a, quote, demonic, destructive suction tube, unquote, siphoning tremendous resources away from human needs. The more things change, the more they stay the same. With transcendent wisdom, this spring's student uprising has rejected conformity as a lethal anesthetic. While the horrors continue in Gaza, leaders in the most powerful American institutions want to continue as usual, as if official participation in genocide were no particular cause for alarm. Instead, young people have dared to lead the way, insisting that such a culture of death is repugnant and completely unacceptable. It sure is. And that was one terrific piece, okay, in my view. I'll go on now with the second piece. Let me present it. So, hi, Andy. Hi, Kay. And Andy says, that Clausewitz statement gave me chills. Yeah, Clausewitz is sometimes chilling. It was interesting that his model was actually Napoleon and the experiences of Napoleon in fighting with Russia. That's a very interesting thing. Anyway, on to the next piece. We have a few pieces to go through tonight. There's something I must do that I forgot to do before I share the next piece. Specifically, I have to share to Facebook, make sure people know that I'm live there. So, let me do the sharing there. So there we are. Now I'll go back to sharing. This piece from Common Dreams, another piece from Common Dreams. The name of it is Weaponizing Anti-Semitism. And here you see in the picture, pro-Palestinian students and activists face police officers who again are militarized. They always seem to be militarized these days. After protesters were evicted from a library on campus earlier in the day at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. That was the place where in the George Floyd protests, there were many confrontations between protesters, and the police, and where people were grabbed off the streets and taken away in unmarked cars by people who also didn't have any markings. That was the style of doing things in the Trump administration. At least we haven't had that yet in the Biden administration. Weaponizing anti-Semitism, why we must maintain our focus on the agonies of Gaza and the West Bank, denouncing them and calling for an end to Israel's assaults. This is by Ellen Canterow and Jennifer Lowenstein, written on May 10th, 2024. It's for Common Dreams. All of us Sorry, I was distracted a bit. All of us, and we are legion across the world, must keep our eyes on the genocide in Gaza, as well as on the vicious pogroms underway in the West Bank. A recent statement by James Elder of UNICEF reports that in Rafah, quote, the European hospital is crammed with severely injured and dying children. A military offensive here will be catastrophic. At the same time, throughout the West Bank, mobs of fascist settlers torch homes, steal possessions, including livestock, kill Palestinians, and drive them off their land. All of this has been enabled by President Joseph Biden, who has sent fulsome amounts of aid to Israel to carry out its genocidal and ethnic cleansing assaults on the Palestinian people. A Holocaust underwritten by the greatest military power in the world is underway in both of the occupied territories. Well, I'm not sure we're the greatest military power in the world anymore, but I guess that's a point of argument. Okay, after Ukraine and what's happened there, and our lack of capability to continue to supply the Ukrainians, I'm actually glad of that particular lack of capability because I want to see, an end to the war. But the point is, the inability of the United States to really continue it is what we're seeing now. And that kind of gives the lie to the statement that we are the greatest military power in the world. Promoting the savageries, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said, quote, whoever perpetrates against the Jewish people like these evil ones have perpetrated on us will be destroyed. They will be annihilated, and it will echo for decades and decades onwards. Yes, reminds me of the 1,000-Year Reich. In another statement, he declared, quote, Rafah, Deir, al-Bala, Nusayrat, total and utter destruction that will erase the memory of the Amalek from under the skies. This is the fulfillment of Israel's dream of inhabiting all of what was once historic Palestine, making it a land unencumbered by its indigenous Arab population. Israel's ongoing efforts since 1948 to kill or expel all Palestinians from what was historic Palestine have triggered student sit-ins and demonstrations on some 120 American college campuses. Israel has become a country with powerful fascistic tendencies, headed by fanatics and demagogues, catering to a population so filled with hatred of Arabs that it welcomes the genocide. In a recent article, Dead on Arrival, Israel's blowback to genocide, unquote, Ellen Cantero, one of the co-authors of this article, recalls visiting the West Bank city of Hebron in the 1980s and seeing graffiti on walls that proclaimed, quote, Arabs to the gas chambers, unquote. At the time, renowned Israeli public intellectual Yeshayahu Leibowitz warned that Israel was turning its soldiers into Judeo-Nazis. Recent YouTube videos of soldiers mocking their victims bear out his prophecy. This hatred is pervasive in Israel. There are courageous exceptions, such as journalists Amira Haas and also Gideon Levy, who write for the newspaper Haaretz and the group Combatants for Peace, but all too many Israelis have supported their country's assault on Gaza or even wanted something worse. The student protests that for weeks have been under public scrutiny have been peaceful mass gatherings of citizens outraged at Biden's unconditional support for Israel's relentless campaign in Gaza. Yet early on, riot police were summoned to Columbia's campus, as well as that of the City College of New York, the University of Texas, Austin, UCLA, and others, to dismantle the encampments, arrest, and sometimes beat up students and supporting faculty. Ayman Mohadeen on MSNBC last week showed images of a mob hurling fireworks at the UCLA protesters, spraying them with pepper spray and beating them with sticks and other weapons. In tandem with the police actions, cries of, quote, anti-Semitism, unquote, have arisen about the protests. When interviewed in print or on television, the Jewish student activists have said unanimously that these protests are neither anti-Semitic nor hate-filled. Moreover, the anti-Semitism claims are irreconcilable with the fact that thousands of Jewish students nationwide are participating. Two leading protest organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, are Jewish, proclaiming that never again may genocide take place. May genocide take place against any people, not just Jews. Both of us writers of this article have experienced real anti-Semitism. Ellen remembers in her early childhood, around 1945, her mother saying that the local grocer, Mr. McGonigal, was glad Hitler was, quote, mopping up all the kikes, unquote. She remembers a child in a third grade class who called her, quote, a kike, unquote. Jennifer remembers being pelted with spitballs by classmates shouting, Jew, quote unquote, at her for making a Star of David design in her art class. Meanwhile, her father recalled being chased around the block by a neighborhood bully, bully holding a knife saying, quote, you killed Christ. These experiences mirror what until now has been the guiding definition of anti-Semitism, that of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA. Quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish and non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities, unquote. Yet the campaign against alleged anti-Semitism, quote unquote, has gone forward, adding criticism of Israel to the definition of the term. In Congress, the House of Representatives passed a bill entitled the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, quote unquote. It makes speech seemingly threatening the existence of Israel newly, quote, anti-Semitic, unquote, citing, for example, the cry, quote, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, unquote, as a call for the annihilation of the Jewish state and of the Jews in it. It makes no difference that Jewish students and people like the writers of this article have chanted that slogan, including intending its meaning to be that Palestinians should be free within a redefined state. Congressman Gerald Bernadler, a longtime supporter of Israel and a Zionist, has criticized the bill. Quote, well, there is much in the bill that I agree with, unquote, he said. Quote, its core provision would put a thumb on the scale in favor of one particular definition of anti-Semitism to the exclusion of all others to be used when the Department of Education assesses claims of anti-Semitism on campus, unquote. He continued that the new definition includes, quote, contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, unquote, adding, quote, the problem is that these examples may include protected speech in some contexts, particularly with respect to criticism of the state of Israel, unquote. Um, uh, Omer Bartov, an Israeli-American professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, I played a video of Bartov yesterday and discussed it on my show. Described by the U.S. Holocaust by the Memorial Museum as one of the world's leading specialists on the subject of genocide, is the author of an article entitled Weaponizing Language, Misuses of Holocaust Memory, and the Never Again Syndrome, unquote. In a recent dialogue with the Israeli Holocaust scholar Raz Segal, the two discussed anti-Semitism and, quote, the perils of anti-Semitism and the weaponization of it currently. In an April 30th interview on Democracy Now!, Bartov noted that the peaceful nature of the University of Pennsylvania demonstration, as well as the one at Brown University, of anti-Semitism, he said that it, quote, is a vile sentiment. It's an old sentiment that has been used for bloodshed, for violence, and for genocide. But it has also become a tool to silence speech about Israel. And that, too, has quite a history. And numerous governments under Benjamin Netanyahu have been pushing this agenda of arguing that any criticism of Israeli policy, not least of Israeli occupation policies, is anti-Semitic. He added that there are Jewish students who feel threatened, for instance, by the term, quote, intifada, unquote, which literally means shaking off, quote unquote, as in the shaking off of the 57-year-old occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, quote, but there's nothing threatening about opposing aggression, unquote. Well, there may be something threatening to Netanyahu in doing that, because if they are successful in shaking off the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, then Netanyahu, his usefulness will be ended, even to the most rabid of the Israeli people, and he might be going to jail. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which indeed weaponizes anti-Semitism against those protesting Israel's savagery in Gaza, such as all the students across the United States, and myself, and my colleagues on around the world with Dee and Friends, and the cruelty of its overall occupation policies is soon to be voted upon by the Senate. Its enactment would mark a giant step towards degrading the U.S. Constitution, in particular its protection of freedom of speech, assembly, and a free press. It also threatens the status of academia as a realm in which the free exchange of ideas can flourish. Fascism threatens American democracy embodied in a Republican Party that has long ceased to be a political party and is rather, according to Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, quote, an insurrection, unquote. The re-election of Donald Trump would import an Israeli-style fascism embodied by Netanyahu and Smotrich, while the re-election of Joe Biden will allow these smoldering tendencies to ignite the flame of that ideology within the United States. If the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is passed by the Senate, the erosion of civil liberties long anchored in the Constitution seems all but certain. So, in other words, fascism stalks us not just in the Republican Party, but also through the Democratic Party and the cessation of its support for the civil liberties long anchored in the Constitution. the threat of fascism comes from both of our major parties. That's not in the article. That is my addition. Like all forms of prejudice and prejudice and ethnocentrism, anti-Semitism has no place in an enlightened society. But what about genocide? Is that an acceptable manifestation of a modern society? Are those denouncing protests against Israel's genocidal and ethnic cleansing actions okay, knowing that over 100,000 people, most of them women and children, have been killed, wounded, and maimed in indiscriminate bombing raids across the Strip since October 7th? Meanwhile, all the focus on alleged anti-Semitism has diverted national attention from the genocide in Gaza and the barbaric settler actions in the West Bank. The official number of Gaza's dead is close to 35,000, with another 8 to 10,000 people unaccounted for under the rubble. If 6,000 of these people were Hamas fighters, that still leaves a total of 40,000 civilians dead. News of atrocities within this Holocaust continues. Recently, UN Special Rapporteur of the Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, stated, "I'm extremely alarmed by information that Dr. Adnan Albersh, a well-known surgeon at #Al-Shifa Hospital, has died while detained by Israeli forces in the Ofer military prison. While I acquire more information, I urge the diplomatic community to intervene with concrete measures to protect Palestinians. No Palestinian is safe under Israel's occupation today." I believe that's a true statement, folks. They're certainly not safe, in the West Bank, and certainly not in Gaza. And they're not safe in East Jerusalem either. Israel is neither a democratic nor a peace-loving society. It is an arm of U.S. regional hegemony and a client state that receives $3.8 billion annually in military aid, and that has received over $30 billion additional military aid since October 7th. Since its founding in 1948, Israel has received $158 billion in military support. And if you consider inflation, most probably you can double that if you view it in current dollars, making it the greatest recipient of U.S. military aid in history. Israel has nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, the only such power in the Middle East to have this kind of arsenal. We suggest the next time someone complains that, quote, little Israel, unquote, is, quote, surrounded by enemies, unquote, a false statement to begin with, people consider these facts. We look no further than Tel Aviv to determine which nation is the real destabilizing force in the region. If the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act passes the Senate, what will befall student protests? Will they all become acts of civil disobedience? What about the alternative press, whose independent organs have become invaluable, given the corporate media's pussyfooting or downright ignoring of the Gaza Holocaust and West Bank atrocities? Will it be shuttered by the federal government on the grounds of banned hate speech? Will what we write be rejected by publications that fear for their survival? As a Jewish person who stands hand in hand with my Palestinian brothers and sisters, this is a quote, with my Palestinian brothers and sisters and works daily against anti-Arab hate, I find this weaponization of my identity particularly disgusting, states Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee Staff Attorney Chris Godchild Bennett. Quote again, criticism of Zionism and of the Israeli government is not anti-Semitic, and conflating the two only serves to provide cover for Israel's numerous ongoing human rights abuses and violations of international law, as well as its genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, unquote. Declares Palestinian poet Mohammed al-Kurd, quote, I'm asked to have patience for these kinds of debates that tell me that words are genocidal. The Israeli regime is engaging in a war of attrition against the Palestinian people, and yet we are asked to talk about chants and slogans. But this is about our moral obligation as human beings to reject a genocide, the real genocide that is happening in real time, unquote. All people of conscience must keep this in mind, and we must maintain our focus on the agonies of Gaza and the West Bank, denouncing them and calling for an end to Israel's assault, to settler violence, and ultimately to the occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza. We must honor the student demonstrators and all who champion them as the heroes they are, cease the opportunistic abuse of the term anti-Semitism, quote unquote, and urge them to continue their protests. And so I do with my whole heart. But I also have to say that to be successful in helping to end this particular genocidal war, which will probably have to be ended by the United States saying enough in very clear terms. For that reason, we must also have one eye on the genocide in Gaza and the other eye on the emergence of fascism here, in this country, because the Awareness of Anti-Semitism Act and the breaking up of these protests by police, violating freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and being supported and being part of basically counter-protest efforts coming from the President of the United States, coming from the Speaker of the House, and pretty much the whole House from 320 to 391, collaboration of them with the political donors to both parties, with the donors to the universities, with the administrators of the universities, and with occasional counter-protests from street gangs supporting Zionism that were tolerated by the police in Los Angeles, beating students, shooting fireworks at them. This is the emergence of an alliance that is fascistic, in character. Trump supports this alliance too. It's not just Biden, not just the Democrats. It's the Republicans and Trump too. And it's the mass media and other corporations that support this too. They're all together in what can only be called an emerging fascist movement here in the United States. The very use of the police to break up these exercises of free speech and free assembly for political reason, that is one of the defining characteristics, of fascism. We see the Democrats engaging in that while shouting continuously about Donald Trump posing the danger of fascism for the rest of us. That Donald Trump needs to be defeated because he is the fascist danger. And the administration and the Democratic Party in Congress and elsewhere, the Democratic National Committee, while they scream this as loudly as they can, practice fascism on the college campuses themselves. That is what is going on there. And that is what will probably continue to go on there until they finally break the students. So, I'm going to move on now. I know it's Dee's time. We're very close to her time. And I will be over there as quickly as I can. But before that, no, I think I've done enough for tonight. I don't think I really have to continue. I think I've made the basic point here. Okay. And that point is that you can see the fascism in the attempted repression and suppression of the campus protests. It is here right now. It is not waiting for Donald Trump but to get elected. Okay. It is here now. And we have to do something about it now. And we have to do something about it at the polls. And that cannot include simply rejecting Biden and electing Trump. Both parties are fascistic now. We must, and I come back to a favorite theme of mine, we must dump the corruption. We must vote for candidates from third parties who have not been bought by big money. Because it is the big money from the military-industrial complex, and the big money from the Israel lobby that is buying the Congress and buying the president and making them complicit in the genocide that is now going on, in Gaza. The buying of the Congress is part and parcel, and the buying of the presidency is part and parcel of the emerging fascism here in the United States. And if we want to get rid of that fascism, we have to dump the corruption by cleaning house in Congress and by cleaning house at the presidential level. And that means whatever ads you see, do not vote for a Democrat for president, for a Republican for president, or for Democrats, and Republicans who are taking big money, who are sitting in the House and sitting in the Senate. Of course, it's appropriate for me now to share the screen for the rule that I often use. The rule says vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corporations, individuals, PACs, or party committees, and who repudiate all super PAC support. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I am telling you who to vote against. And this rule tells you who to vote against. I leave it to you to decide who to vote for. I'm sorry, I wasn't sharing the rule. So here it is. Vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corps, individuals, PACs, or party committees, and who repudiate all super PAC support. That's the way to get rid of the fascism. That's the way, okay, to get rid of it. So I had two articles that I was going to cover, but I've run out of time. I will spend a few minutes in covering your comments. Then I'm going to move over to join D. Andy Canny says, Joe, what's a good comeback for the soulless bastards that claim that Palestine was never a state? Enjoyed that first article I shared to Fascist Book. Oh, thank you, Andy. I think a good comeback is that Palestine was supposed to be a state according to the UN partition and the resolution partitioning Palestine into what was to be a Jewish state and what was to be a Palestinian state. But that what's happened since 1947-48 is that at every turn, the Israelis have stopped the establishment of a Palestinian state, have opposed, while sometimes mouthing support for it, have opposed a two-state solution to that since 1948 in all sorts of ways. That's a primary reason why the Palestinians were never able to establish a state. But whether the Palestinians were ever to establish a state or not, Palestinians are clearly a people. Clearly, okay, a nationality. And they are entitled to self-determination according to international law. I think that's a good comeback for the soulless bastards. And Rittenhouse was allowed to murder at whim. Yes, he was. And he says, oh, I can't see for shit. That's what she says. And Geraldine Chambers says, thank you for covering this. You're very welcome, Geraldine. Thank you for returning for this live stream. And John B. says, when you see the university's response on behalf of Zionist sponsors to genocide, one realizes why Heterodox has made no headway getting MMT into to academic academia. I think I disagree with this, okay, a little. The reason why, okay, I disagree a little, even though it's a hard struggle, I think MMT has been making progress in getting into academia, and that we are today much further along than when I first became involved in late 2009, 2010. Yes, it's been 14 years now, starting on my 15th year. Actually started in my 15th year, late in 2000. I've started on my 15th year now. I started on it late in 2023, I believe. No, I think it's 14 years. Stick with that. Andy Kenny says, exactly, Joe, getting money out of politics. That dumped the corruption. If we got that money out of politics, that recent vote of 320 to 91 in the House of Representatives would have been far, far different, I'm sure. So thank you for coming. That ends my stream for tonight. I'm going to go over to D's. I'll see you there. And I may see you on Saturday night. I may not. But if not, I will see you next Tuesday, as long as the creeks don't rise.